The fourth study in this study of the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians finally gets to the topic that Paul had been asked to talk about. Chapter 7, verses 1 to 40. Paul says, now, matters that you wrote about, and there seem to be two basic issues that he had in mind. First of all, the question about marriage, and then, as we will see in the very next section, the question about meat offered to idols. Now, we might just reflect on this a little bit. This does say that the people in Corinth were concerned. They did have this question about, are we living faithfully for the Lord? It's not that they simply were scoffing the Lord and saying, none of this matters. We'll do whatever we want to. They were seeking help. It's just there were some issues, Paul says, that they weren't thinking about that were also offensive to him. The thing about the man with his stepmother and the lawsuits, the question of factions within the congregation, later the question about spiritual gifts and about the Holy Communion meal that they had together. Those are all issues that Paul finds are important to deal with as well. But we must say, these people were serious about trying to live as Christians, and the issue that they came up with was the whole thing about marriage. Oddly enough, Paul says, well, you think you're married to idols, or you think you're still married to the world, in that there are some things you think of to do that way, but the issue seems to have come up. What happens if I am a Christian and my spouse is not? What happens if we want to get married? And we have some indication from you, Paul, that because you're not married and Barnabas is not married, maybe it is pleasing to God that we would not be married. And so Paul tries to get at this issue, but you'll notice, if you look carefully at the way the argumentation goes, that unlike the very structured setting that he has in these other ones where he says, this is what I would do, this is how I would act on it, this is what you should watch out for with idolatry and sexual immorality, etc. Now all of a sudden, it seems like he's bending over backwards. It's almost as if he's standing there, and if Sosthenes is the one who's doing the writing, that Paul says, well, let me think about this, and from this angle, how about, it just keeps on going back and forth. What seems to be in the mind of Paul is that the church is being threatened. Maybe he is aware also that just in the Roman Empire, there are real problems on the horizon. This is just, maybe 10 years or so before the time that Paul dies. Most say that this letter is written about 55 AD, so roughly 2 decades after Jesus' death and resurrection, and about another decade later, and Paul, according to tradition, will be killed in Rome by Nero. Paul sees the real threat that this message of Jesus Christ will bring to the world. And it's not just an idle threat. There are people whose lives are threatened and whose livelihoods are threatened. We see that as Paul travels on various missionary journeys, and people whose livelihood is made by idolatry and selling idols want to kill Paul or throw him out of town. We know that Jesus himself is put to death, both by the Romans under Pilate and the Jews under Annas and Caiaphas, who see Jesus as a terrible threat to a way of life that they believe is the right one. So as he writes now, he's going to get into a variety of different settings. First of all, he says, now, what's the normal relationship of sexual activity for a husband and wife? Well, he says, when you got married, you kind of gave yourself to each other, and you said, I'm here for you. You'll note that Paul doesn't say the husband owns the wife's body, and that's that. He says the husband has been given his wife, and she gives herself to him. And so, in essence, he says he owns her body, or he has the rights to her body. But then he turns right around and says, and the husband has given himself to his wife. She owns or has the rights to his body. Essentially, when it says the two become one flesh, and that they are brought together because the Lord is carrying out this built-in desire for the spouse and for the care and sexual activity as well. Paul says this is not something where you should lightly say, well, we just won't have any sexual relations anymore because that wouldn't be a godly thing. That will be something where God doesn't want us to enjoy our bodies and the relationship with one another. That, Paul says, is not right. It's not as if the sexual activity itself is a sin. Now remember, he's just gotten through in 2 chapters with talking about all the sexual immorality and the man with his father's wife. And so someone might say, well, if there's all these problems with sex, the best thing to do would be to stay away from all sexual activity altogether. Paul has almost kind of led into that and said, no. No, in the context of marriage, this is a wonderful gift. It is to be kept. It is to be used. It is, in fact, the way God has built it in. But, he says, on my authority sometimes and sometimes on the Lord's authority, he says, if two people say, well, we are going to abstain from sexual activity for a time, and we're going to pray, and as we recognize our desires for one another, we're going to also be thinking about our desires to serve the Lord. But Paul says that's not to be something that's going to go on forever. That will not be pleasing to God. It will not be what's necessary. Paul says, I'm not married, and I'm going through a lot of struggles for the church. The Lord's given me that gift, but it is not appropriate within marriage that two people would hold back from each other and would hold back from the blessings that God provides in that marriage setting. So he's rather clear here that this is not a kind of a higher level. The Roman Catholic Church, which puts a higher level on being married to God rather than to a spouse, and misusing the later verses in this chapter that talk about who one is responsible for, has really pushed that much farther than Paul would make it. He says, well, it's okay that some people have that gift, but it's not something to be pushed on everyone. So then he goes on, and he says in verses 8 to 9, how about the unmarried widows? I'm sorry, how about the unmarried and the widows and those who are in a particular circumstance? He says, I'd rather have you stay as I am. I'm not married, and there are certain problems that come in this world that I'd rather you don't have. All within this context, though, that Paul thinks there's going to be terrible anguish up ahead. Anguish that if someone gets married and has children, they're going to watch their children maybe starve to death or be tortured. I don't know too many stories. In fact, none come to mind directly from the New Testament era, some from the Old Testament era, where children were also punished and hurt cruelly because of their faith. But there are many, many stories about adults in the earliest church time period, from time to time, not every year, but from time to time, where they were hurt and tortured because they were believers. And thus Paul says, if you are inflamed with passion, if you have this strong urge to have sexual fulfillment, then get married. But if you're not married and you seem to be doing okay, or if you are a widow, particularly in the case of the counsel that Paul gives within the New Testament, if you are particularly a young widow and you still could have children, then if you really want to, then don't stay single. Then it's okay. The Lord is not going to be chasing after you, punishing you because you have these desires. So it's not the fact that people have desires that's wrong, unlike what those Greeks were talking about, as we talked about last time. But it's a misuse of those, where it goes outside the bounds of the way the Lord had put it together. So Paul says if you're inflamed and you're just burning to death about these sexual matters, then don't go and be immoral and just find a way to physically take care of your desires. Put it within the right context of a marriage, and then it's okay if you want to get married. Then in verses 10 to 11 he says, now to those who are married, don't separate. And he says this is the Lord's command. He says, now what about if you are a woman and your husband is an unbeliever? Should you say, well, I'm not supposed to be married to an unbeliever, and so I will just separate and divorce myself, and then I'll be a better person, I'll be a better Christian? No, he says, that's not the Lord's command. The Lord's command is that you stay in the relationship that you are in. And it is not proper then that you are going to go and get a divorce. He goes on in verses 12-16 and he says, now if you are married to someone who is not a believer, because you are, then you are able to stay in that relationship. Maybe your presence there will bring a blessing, maybe even that your spouse will come to faith. If your unbelieving spouse says it's okay, you can do whatever you want, fine. But oddly enough, and I think most of us would be rather surprised if somebody would ask us the question, does the Bible permit divorce? Yes, it does. If I am married to someone who says, if you are going to be a Christian, I don't want to be with you. And I'm going to forbid you to be a Christian. I'm going to forbid that you can do any kind of Christian instruction with our children. You are going to do what I tell you to do. Then Paul says, if you would be forced to deny that Jesus Christ is your Lord, then the Lord would say, it's okay to depart from that spouse. Don't push it. Don't try to make it happen because you're saying, well, I will be holier or God will be more pleased with me if I'm not caught with this person who's not a believer. Remember in the section where Paul says you can't be away from the world. You're going to be with unbelievers, and you're going to rub shoulders with them, and that's just the way it's going to be in this world. Well, here he says, maybe your spouse will come around someday. Maybe your presence there will help bring the blessing of the Lord into your marriage that way as well. True, that person has to come to faith and is not saved just by your marriage. But if you have a chance, that's the first place to stay. In verses 17-20, he says, stay in the situation that you're in. If you're circumcised, don't try and remove the marks of it. If you're uncircumcised, don't become circumcised. In other words, don't say, I've got to try to become something. I have to have some laws that I will follow. In verses 31-34, he talks about slaves, and he says, you were bought with a price. In essence, you were not only bought with the price to make you a slave of your owner, you were bought with a price and you've been linked in with the Lord. If you can get out of being a slave, fine. But don't make that your prime goal. And this is in general the situation. Don't think that somehow you have to change all the circumstances of your life now that you have become a Christian. Remember, Paul is talking to people who became Christians as adults, who might have said, we want to show the Lord we're really in it for him, and we really want to be perfect people. And they went off kind of foolishly saying, well, let's just not have any desire anymore for our spouse, or let's do this. And Paul says, you're building tensions into your relationship that you don't need to have. In verses 25-31, he says to the virgins, if you can stay single, stay single. Because I want to spare you from all the troubles that are going to come. This world is passing away, and there are going to be so many bits of anguish. I don't want you to have children and have a spouse and you're worried about them or they're worried about you. Verses 32-35, he says, there is a sense in which there are anxieties that are brought into the marriage relationship that are not there for those who are single. And he is aware of that only by what others have said, though there is a tradition that he was married to a woman named Thecla. There is a letter of Paul and Thecla, or a story about Paul and Thecla, Thecla, I think is how it's spelled. But we don't know about that in the New Testament. And thus the main thing he says is, if you want to serve the Lord, then all of your efforts will be put into serving the Lord. If you are married, then some of your time is going to have to be taken with taking care of your family. In the church as it is today, of course, the Roman Catholic Church says that its priests will not marry, based on this particular text and others. In the earliest church, the first centuries of the church, priests did marry. Then it was almost as if the church said, well, if we have priests who are not married, then they are going to be on a higher level, a higher elevation, and people will look up to them because of their greater level of self-control. And it was actually banished, it was not approved any longer. The people who were married, who were priests, were told, you have to get rid of your spouses and no one else can marry. And it has usually been understood, as I understand it, in terms of a power play, that those who were holier then because they were serving the church, and there was great anguish in the church when those marriages were stopped, and many people did not think that that was the right thing to do, or that that was going to be more pleasing to God, and they'd look at the rest of the context of this chapter to say that. Well, Paul says it's nice if you're dedicated to the Lord, if you have a gift that it doesn't bother you, then be as you are. But if it bothers you, then don't think that somehow you will only please the Lord if you follow some particular guideline. In verses 36 to 38, Paul says if you're engaged to be married and you have picked out a young girl that you want to be married to, go ahead. It's not going to be a sin to do that. And then verses 39 to 40, Paul says, if you and your spouse are both alive, then the woman is bound to her spouse. But if he is no longer alive, then she will be free. So, telling her, when you're in a particular circumstance, stay in it. Thus, the bottom line is if you're in a particular situation, whether you are married or unmarried, whether you are a slave or free, don't think that somehow you will only please God by changing all those circumstances. And we would have to expand that into all sorts of things of life, where we would have to ask, is something that we're doing really immoral, or is it really living out the gift that the Lord has given us? We do recognize there are certain problems we may have, but not to put ourselves under a kind of a pressure that we would think that will only be pleasing to God if we change some of our behaviors. Certainly the immorality is not to go on, but in the life that we are, the Lord can bless us, and we don't need to change it in order to become holy. That's something God did to us, and something we do not need to do by proving something to Him. That's really what Paul would say in terms of a whole worldly way of life that we're delivered from. So I hope that is a bit helpful, and even though the issue may not be as pressing for us in terms of the marrying or not marrying, we can get an insight into the way Paul looks at the nature of who we are. And I hope that will be helpful for you. God's continued blessings to you as you study and grow with this letter from Paul.